This week, the agenda recalled one of Toronto's most controversial mayors, considered how to cope with chronic pain, probed the relations between men and women, and dialed into the cool of the six. The agenda's Week in Review begins with the cost of farm internships. Have you come to the same conclusion that Michael has, that you believe going forward there ought to be some kind of stipend? I mean, maybe not minimum wage, but at least something, some money changing hands?
Yeah, Michael and I have had many conversations about this, and I do think that the transparency is vital in terms of enable a farmer and an intern having a very clear understanding, whether it's through a contract or a very clear verbal discussion around what that remuneration is going to look like, if there's going to be money involved or not. If there is not money involved, I think that the education component of those internships has to be substantial, because there are absolutely things that an intern can gain from a non-work environment, such as learning the economics of an entire farm, such as learning things like crop rotation. And we did have interns tell us that I know that I have, especially interns who have been paid employees on farms, that when I was employed a paid employee, I was asked to do very specific tasks. Whereas as an intern, I'm able to gain a much broader understanding of the entire farm experience.
Because you're asked to do everything, I presume.
Because you're asked to do everything, but you're also open. Books are open to you in most cases. You know, you get a much bigger picture. So that, I think that, yes, it's important to give to pay interns at some level, but if they're not being paid, I think that needs to be clear, and there needs to be a substantial education component that is, again, not just substantial, but has some real content to it.
Michael, let's just also be very clear about who is doing this, because my hunch is the public would be not at all amused if you were to find out that, you know, a migrant from, let's say, Mexico who was trying to support a family of 5 was being, I mean, that would be exploitation. As opposed to somebody who found themselves at the University of Guelph, 20 years old, and was trying to get more education. You'll acknowledge there's a difference there.
Yeah, of course. I think that we're dealing with a very segmented labor market, in the sense that you have seasonal migrant workers on many conventional farms and some organic farms, and then you have a huge number of generally young, white, middle-class, well-educated women, predominantly, and some men, staffing farms. So there's a real segmentation there, to be sure. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize that the labor market, even if you're a middle-class youth, is not what it once was. Many students are coming out of undergrad. Certainly my students I teach at the University of Toronto, with very, very few job prospects. So I think in part these internships are a way to defer entry into the formal labor market, but they also reflect a labor market that is increasingly casual, that increasingly asks people to work outside of a waged relation.
Well, let's also, Charles, clarify this. It wasn't that long ago that the Ministry of Labor ruled that various media outlets in this city were in violation of the law, and they prohibited those internships from continuing because they were unpaid. Are you convinced that what's happening here is actually legal?
I hesitate, as not being a lawyer, commenting too much on the legal question, but it is, there are some specific criteria that make something an internship. And one of the key pieces to that is the work being done cannot be providing net value to the business. If an intern is replacing work that could be done by a paid employee, that is one of the things that invalidates an internship, and that's Ontario law. I mean, that's part of what that whole case has been about. The reality on farms is there are a wealth of exceptions to farm labor. For example, on farms, there's no minimum wage that has to be paid to farm workers.
They're exempted from that already.
They're exempted from it.
Mm-hmm.
There's also no overtime, no vacation pay, and the list goes on. So, in many ways, it's unclear to us whether where the legal position stands, but as long as a lot of farmers are paying workers insurance and meeting those criteria, then at this point it's hard to understand if there's any actual legal challenge there.
There was a case though, Michael. You're going to help me with the details here because I don't remember all of them. Vancouver Island, couple of apprentices sued for like back pay or something like that, saying that they felt they were at the end of the day entitled to something. I'm not sure how it all resolved itself. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, of course.
Okay,
yeah,
what happened?
Well, I'll be very brief, but So there was 2 farm apprentices that were working on a farm, and the farm host also had paid workers who were helping pick berries, I believe it was. And the farm interns felt that they were doing the same work as the paid workers.
And therefore entitled to some compensation.
And therefore entitled to compensation.
And they sued.
Well, they sued, and they were awarded back wages because the farm host consulted a number of lawyers and said, you don't have a case. Now, what's unique about BC in comparison to Ontario is that in British Columbia, the exceptions to employment law and labor law are not nearly as deep. So British Columbia actually has minimum wage standards for agricultural workers.
Now I gather in this case they settled at a mediated stage and therefore it didn't actually go to court.
Yeah, it didn't actually go to court.
But do you think that case has any implications for the province of Ontario?
Of course. I think it certainly sent a chill through the farming sector. When we visit farms, one of the key things that farmers ask us when we're doing interviews with them is it possible that you could see a similar case occurring in Ontario? Now, the thing that's unique about Ontario is that there's no minimum wage standards, which
on farms.
On farms, pardon me, yes, on farms. And so that makes it a very unique situation in the sense that there is no floor for wages. So is someone entitled to wages if farm workers aren't entitled to minimum wage? That's an open question, and I don't think anyone has an answer to that.
I'm going to start with a rather lengthy excerpt from your book, so get comfortable for a second. And I guess I have to,
Okay.
I mean, there are some parts of the book where you use fairly blue language. This is really minor league blue language, but I do feel an obligation, since we're on in prime time, to sort of warn parents, hide your kids' ears for just a second. Here we go. Now that men have become less economically necessary and there's less reason than ever to pretend to admire them, scorn for men has become the post-feminist fallback position, widely regarded as a badge of feistiness and independence. Nevertheless, men remain conduits to things a lot of women still deeply want: sex, love, babies, commitments. It's a contradictory situation, but get a bunch of women in a room, add liquor, and jokes about men's inadequacies fly like shrapnel. When it comes to dating, single men are dogs, infants, sex-obsessed, moral rodents, or emotional incompetents. And once you finally land one, nothing much improves, since husbands are morons, selfish, workaholics, emotionally unavailable, and domestically unavailable. Single men lie and mislead to get sex. Husbands have lost interest in sex entirely. Men are emotionally autistic, except for all the ones who want you to be their mother. Men can't talk about their feelings, except for the ones who won't shut up about them. They're macho assholes, except when they're wimps. Okay, well, Laura, get off the fence and tell us what you really think, first of all.
I want to say that I was just channeling the culture here. I
Right.
myself have completely benign feelings toward all men.
It's a point worth clarifying that you're not actually saying this, but you are sort of reflecting what is certainly out there in the zeitgeist about this. Did women feel differently about men when they were economically more dependent upon them?
I don't know if they felt differently, but I guess there were less venues for expression or less freedom for expression. I mean, if you read somebody like Dorothy Parker, although of course she was economically independent herself, but I mean, you can read people from all the generations, women, I mean, all the generations of the 20th century, and hear those kinds of things, at least in the subtext, if not stated, so forthrightly. So I think these are recognizable feelings. I think they're probably stated more openly now.
There seems to be a lot of scorn, though, that is a regular feature of the post-feminist position. Why do you think that is?
I do think that there's this sense of being fed up with men that you hear articulated a lot more. And, I mean, it may have something to do with the more economic independence, but I think it also has something to do with changes in male culture as well, in ways that men have become more more independent themselves and less likely to sign on for some of the traditional roles that I think a lot of women actually still want them to play, like, fiance or committed husband or breadwinner. And some of those changes are economic, but I do think that there are changes in men's willingness to depart from these traditional narratives too. So there's maybe more mismatch between the sexes in terms of, getting together to share some sort of common narrative.
But you don't dislike men, and yet you do write some stuff in here about men, in your book, Men, that no man could get away with writing about women, right?
I don't know, have you read a novel lately? I mean, I think there are, say, a lot of male novelists who say incredibly scathing things about women. I mean, read Philip Roth or John Updike. I mean, these are great chroniclers of male dissatisfaction with women. Saul Bellow, who's, actually one of my favorite writers. So I guess it depends on the venue, but, I think men have been scathing about women over the years.
Okay, but you write here, what strikes me most about these essays is my covert envy of men, including ones that I would like to thrash and dismember. That's a little close to the edge there, isn't it, Laura?
Oh gosh, I thought that was affectionate. I mean, as I said, wasn't so much trying to be polite as to articulate things that I suppose run kind of deep for me, and I don't think I'm alone. So I think to some extent I'm speaking things that most women feel somewhere. I mean, I do think, let's just get off the pretense about it. I mean, I think for men and women both, particularly in the context of heterosexual relations, there's, like I said, a lot of mutual disappointment and various kinds of antagonisms that get expressed in different sorts of ways. The passage you read at the beginning is a way that, women, in the guise of joking about men and their failures, express disappointment. But, look at a New Yorker cartoon or stand-up comedians. They're saying a lot of the same stuff. So there are these different venues and contexts where a lot of this gets articulated.
Okay, you do have a line, though, that I think I need some clarification on, which is women take men too seriously and not seriously enough. What does that mean? Mm-hmm.
Well, the disappointment, I mean, if you read it, here's a fancy word, like dialectically. I mean, the expression of disappointment is also an expression of a desire for something that's not being fulfilled. So I think that, again, in the context of heterosexual culture, there is on the part of women this desire for men to fulfill us, to play a role in our lives, in our romantic lives, in our futures, in our domestic lives, all of that. And, to the extent that men are willing to play along, okay, that's great. But I do think more and more, because of a lot of shifting issues in the culture at large, the economic shifts, women entering the professions, all sorts of stuff, women leaving marriages at higher rates. There just are there's a kind of level of fractiousness and mutual senses, I think, of, not getting what you want from the other person.
What was the genesis of why you and the police at the time didn't get on very well?
Well, I'd been a critic, that's why. I mean, in the 70s, cops were tops. you didn't go around criticizing them. And I remember my friend Patrick Shepard and I, and his picture's on the cover of the book with me, we would go to Metro Council and say, we'd like to see a copy of the police budget. Oh no, they said, you can't see that. Oh, excuse me? You can't see it, they say. And there was a lot of...
Your job was to approve it, right? Not go line by line.
Not to look at it.
You just had to approve it, if I recall.
That's right, and we were saying we wanted to see what it said. And there had been a whole bunch of reports by very significant people, judges, and Arthur Maloney, a big criminal lawyer, and Walter Pittman, who were saying the police have to change. We have to change the way we're training them. We have to change who's allowed to be a police officer, no height and weight requirements. We have to have an independent complaints mechanism. And the police authorities just said, no.
Why do you think they were so resistant to reforming?
Because they thought they could get away with it. And I think the police, there's a very strong police culture and always has been. I think they said, sorry, we don't want to change. We're in charge. We're protecting the public from crime, and therefore leave us alone. Whereas people like me would say, no, hold on a second, there's a two-way street here. And then what happened was in the summer of '79, police shot and killed a black man, Albert Johnson, in his house. He was mentally ill, people knew him, everybody in the neighborhood knew him, he wasn't dangerous, but they killed him. And I made a speech about that and saying, that's wrong. The police shouldn't do that. We've got to start changing a lot of policy. And I asked the police board to change the policy. Well, some people were furious at me about that, and Paul Godfrey, who was the Metro chairman, appointed Cardinal Carter to head up a royal commission or a little committee to figure out about police-community relations. But I was vilified as being a cop hater for saying these things that, in fact, a lot of other people had said before me, but I was mayor and not supposed to say them, I guess.
You were a bit, if I can put it this way, you were a bit of an easy target for them insofar as a lot of what you did 35 years ago is very conventional wisdom today. But I mean, you were the mayor who rode to work on his bike, right?
Yeah.
And now politicians do that today, but they didn't do it 35 years ago,
true.
right?
That's true.
And you know, for the longest time, I guess while you were city councillor, you know, you dressed kind of scruffy and wore your hair kind of scruffy, and now you put a suit on when you became mayor.
You know, that protected me. I mean, I wore jeans and a leather jacket, and I could say to people, I'm different than those other councillors. So it was a protection for me. But there's no question, when I ran for mayor, the first thing I did is I put on a suit and a tie.
Yes, you did.
You know, and there I am as mayor, always wearing suit and tie, going to Harry Rosen's because I knew that they would dress me and I wouldn't have to worry about it, and no one would ever talk about my clothes. And they didn't. They talked about what I was saying about the police.
Your style of leadership, John Sewell, I don't have to tell you, got you in trouble a few times when you were mayor of the city, and you acknowledged that. But here's what you say: doing nothing avoids criticism, but that was never my style. My public role was tackling problems and public issues and engaging others in a search for solutions. Life is too short to be quiet in the face of injustice or even inefficiencies. I don't regret this kind of stance for a moment. Okay, you don't regret it. But you know darn well that if you just put a little water in your wine, you'd have had more than one term probably, right?
That might be true, yeah. There's a cost to doing it. Maybe I didn't do it quite right. Maybe if I'd had really good media advisors. I mean, one of the things, and I talk about it in the book, is the question of whether I should have a media person on my staff.
I don't think you had one. No, you didn't have one.
I didn't have one. I mean, everybody has them now. That might have helped. I might have been able to find a way to say things in a way that wasn't quite so inflammatory. But on the other hand, these were big subjects. I mean, that whole sexuality question, the question of saying police have to change. I mean, you know, what's really interesting to me is police haven't changed all that much since I was mayor. We've still got the issue of police going around and shooting people and not treating black people correctly, and on and on and on. So, you know, these are big and difficult issues. So I'm not unhappy that I grappled with them. Sure, I wish that I could have grappled with them in a way that was a bit more relaxed, and maybe I made some mistakes on that. You know, the thing about politics is that there you are. You have to figure out how you're going to react to things. You don't have a lot of time. You've got a character of a kind of a person you are. Well, you have to do what you can do, and that's all you can do.
Why is the curriculum, Dr. Feldman, being overhauled?
Well, as you said, the medical system is rapidly changing. What patients want from their physicians is rapidly changing with access to information, their own and, you know, on the internet. And of course, our medical students are changing. So with the millennial medical student, it's quite a different scenario than it used to be. We have a slide that we like to show of a class that normally has 250 students, with our director of curriculum, Martin Schreiber, as the lecturer, award-winning, multi-award-winning teacher, and there are 37 students present. And it's because
where's everybody else?
Yeah, well, they're at home watching yesterday's lectures on double speed so that they can save time. And it's not that they're slacking off, they're actually doing sort of clinical shadowing to get earlier clinical experience, to help them with career choices, to get more of a patient interaction that the curriculum wasn't providing.
So, Dr. Sucklingham, I don't want to indulge in the usual stereotypes that we have about millennials, but that feels odd to have, you know, barely more than 10% of the class show up to hear lectures from a guy who I guess is probably a superstar in the field. Is that problematic?
I think it's adaptive to our current society. If we think about how we're delivering healthcare, how our patients even come to us, they've looked up things on the internet, they've looked at apps, they're using things to self-manage. We think about YouTube, all these lectures available online, and sifting through this explosion of information. It makes total sense. People are, practically bored with iPads in their hands nowadays, that it's absolutely makes sense that we would start to shape how we teach our medical students in a way that really, not just mimics, is authentic to the environment that we live in.
Dr. Feldman, are you confident that if they're playing back yesterday's lecture at double speed, they're taking in the knowledge they need appropriately?
And I'm confident that they are, and the reason that is I think medical students today have a lot more insight into their personal learning styles. I'm confident that they're hearing what they need to hear, taking what they need to take from that lecture in a way that they can understand it probably better than if they were just being passively lectured to. Also, they can actually pause it. If they didn't understand something and they want to hear it again and again and again, that's a plus to that sort of scenario.
You confident about it as well?
I am, and I think with that, it's also complementing what happens in the classroom or other learning opportunities, right? So you can often reinforce some of these things and probably get to application of some of these knowledge areas or skill areas that you're hearing about in some of these lectures.
So the students are different, and of course the next question is, okay, is the institution that teaches them changing to accommodate these differences? What's the answer to that?
Well, absolutely. We've had no choice, really, at this point. We've drastically decreased the lecture. So much less of that passive listening, so much more work the night before, for example, flipped classroom idea where you can come in knowing some of the stuff you need to know and actually using the time of a lecture with the content expert to get your questions answered and interact with the material in a more authentic way. Integrate patient voices, which is something that's been done, but not to such a great extent, and that's what the students crave. That's what they went to medical school for.
Is it a bit depressing, though, for the professor to look out at a room that's 75% empty?
Absolutely.
It is.
Which is another reason why it's not benefiting anyone anymore.
Huh. Okay, let's read this. This is an excerpt from the Boston Globe from last fall. Here we go. The curriculum now features more videos created by professors to help students learn, and classroom time is for problem solving in groups, interviewing patients, and thinking through complex situations that might arise in the ward. Schwartzstein, this is Richard Schwartzstein, Harvard professor who helped develop this new curriculum there, he developed his own YouTube videos to describe biological processes students need to learn, which they are expected to watch outside the classroom. The videos are between 5 and 8 minutes, he said, because students' attention spans don't last much longer. Quote, "We are getting a sense from some students anyway that they don't like to read, they prefer videos." I'm trying really not to be an old fuddy-duddy about this, I really am, but how do you not worry that a medical student today can't sit through a 90-minute lecture about something that's probably really important to helping save a life in the future, and patients ought not to be concerned about that?
Well, I think the key is you're really getting to the point about lectures and videos, right? And so if you think about most of the ways in which we watch or view things, we watch at our own pace, we're more self-directed, we have greater access to this information. And if we're saying we're relying on those 8 minutes to learn everything we need to know, then I think we do have a problem. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that's what we're saying. I think what we're saying is we're going to look at these 8 minutes, students are going to decipher what they need to know, but we're going to then bring them into the classroom in small groups, case-based type learning. We're going to apply some of this to actually real virtual patients, right, or patient cases and real patients, right, earlier on. So, if you think about going back, is a 45, 60-minute lecture enough? It's probably not, right, compared to maybe 8 to 10 minutes of the key facts, but then really applying it and digging deeper into what it means in terms of patient care.
Well, let's see how this really happened. I presume at some point students came up to you and said, Dr. Feldman, we appreciate these 2-hour-long lectures, but that's not how our generation learns, and we're really not interested in. You're going to have to change the way you do things. And your reaction was what?
My reaction is, thank you for telling me Right? Thank you for telling me what you need, because I think everyone has the same goal, which is good patient care.
I totally don't believe you. I totally don't believe you. I totally think your initial reaction was, listen, you little snot-nosed kid, I've been at this longer than you and I am offended beyond belief. And then after you got over the indignation of it, maybe we had that second reaction. Am I getting closer to the truth here?
Yeah, fair enough.
Okay, all right, good. Oftentimes, I'm told when people go to the doctor and they complain of pain and they can't really understand why it happened, how it happened, the locality in their body in which it's happening, it's all very kind of amorphous. There may be a tendency by some not to believe, not necessarily doctors, but even colleagues, whoever, not to believe them.
Correct.
How often does that happen?
Quite often, because pain is invisible. Unless you have an amputation, you carry canes, or you're stooped, or you have some deformity that is visible, it's not seen. And there are numerous reasons why pain can be invisible. The reason they are not believed very often is because, number one, it doesn't show. And number two, when you go into medical professionals, our training is very deficient as physicians. So the third thing is that even if our training is deficient, physicians or family practitioners would know that it's a complex issue and they tend to avoid it.
Why would teaching doctors how to recognize and treat pain appropriately not be a high priority at med schools across this province?
This has been a very long problem, though there are very conscious attempts, and our University of Toronto has a marvelous program over at least the last 10 years, would I say that right? In training students from different health professions to understand pain. And also, at least in Ontario, there has been a conscious effort from the Ministry of Health over the past, I would say, 6 or 7 years to improve resources and the lives of patients with pain, at least in our province.
Lynn, did you face this, people not believing you when you said you were in pain?
It still happens, Steve. Huh. It can.
Because they can't see it.
They can't see it, and I just shifted. You know, it is so misunderstood. Luckily for a lot of people, their only frame of reference for what I go through 24/7 is an acute pain episode, a toothache, a broken arm, something like that, where the healing has happened, the pain goes away, and they move on. It is absolutely impossible to understand what it's like to have the pain go on forever.
So am I to understand that the pain that you're experiencing and have for 20 plus years is never going to go away?
You know, I always live in hope that with the research that is being done now by Dr. Stinson, Dr. Malis, and even the involvement of the Canadian Pain Coalition in research, that we are going to figure out what is happening in the body that causes the change, the rewiring of our nervous systems, the oversensitivity of our nervous systems that cause me to be in pain when probably I may not need to be.
This is interesting because we did a program last year, I think it was September of last year. I want to play a clip from that program right now. This is the Vice President of Advocates for the Reform of Prescription Opioids. This woman's son died while using prescribed opioids. Let's play that clip, then we'll come back and chat. Let's roll it, please, Sheldon.
The problem that we're experiencing now, from all of my reading and research, it is from the medical community prescribing, like Michael indicated earlier, pharmaceutical grade heroin. That's what opioids are. They come from the opium poppy.
You know what? Not though he was using it as prescribed?
He was. He was taking it as prescribed. I learned through his girlfriend. He took it as prescribed. He did not crush, he did not snort, he did not inject. And this is where the problem is. As if magically a doctor will give you a pill, you will take the pill, and it won't affect you in any way.
Dr. Stinson, she went on to say that basically, in her view, doctors aren't providing patients adequate information on how to take opioids and manage pain, and as a result, certainly in her son's case, tragedy was the result. Is she right to make that allegation?
Definitely, I think it goes back to Dr. Melis's point about healthcare providers, whether it's physicians or nurse practitioners, not having the education about prescribing opioids in terms of what are the red flags, who might be at high risk, what is the type of monitoring that you have to do. Definitely, we work with children, and as healthcare providers, we take this as a really serious issue, and so there are definitely cases where opioids are warranted for patients, but in children, we don't really know what the long-term impact is on the developing brain of a young teenager, and so we're much more cautious about applying, prescribing opioids, but when we do, we have really stringent monitoring where we have patients sign a contract. We actually prescribe the opioids based on functional, so we make goals and saying, if you're gonna be prescribed these, we have to see an improvement in your functions. We have to see you moving around more, getting back to school. And if they're not willing to make those sort of negotiations and contracts, then we won't prescribe them, especially to pediatric patients.
Dr. Melis, do you think doctors are afraid of being accused of over-medicating their patients?
Doctors are afraid of being accused of both, over-medicating and not providing any treatment at all. I have been saying for many, many years we see a dual tragedy. We see over-prescribing and abuse of opioids in one hand, and we see under-prescribing for hundreds and thousands of people who need proper medications. So I see that in my practice constantly. I see doctors, and I would say minority, who prescribe who prescribe handfuls of opioids, strong medications, without all the appropriate guidelines and mitigating their risk, as Dr. Stinson said. And on the other hand, I see hundreds and hundreds of people who could benefit from small or modest doses of opioids, which make the difference between getting off the bed and going out to shop or being lying in bed 24 hours, and they adamantly refuse to prescribe these medications. We have a major problem in this country and in this province with that split.
Where are you from?
Originally?
Yeah.
London, Ontario, believe it or not.
You're from London?
Yeah.
How'd you get to Toronto?
You know what? London, I outgrew my zone at a young age, and I knew this is the city for me. I'd come here pretty much every year, every summer since I was a kid. And I moved here when I was 19, didn't know one person, very intimidated.
Moved here to do what?
I went here to go to school and then ideally live. And fortunately, I've been here for 16 years.
Went to post-secondary?
Yeah, I went to Humber College.
Went to Humber, and now you're teaching at Humber?
Yeah, I teach at Humber.
Oh, that's kind of sweet. Okay, when you moved to Toronto, which was what year?
2000.
2000, right, 15 years ago. Yeah. Was Toronto cool back then?
For me it was, but definitely not on the global scale. Yeah, definitely not.
But it is now?
It is, yes.
In part because of Drake. We know it's not because of the Leafs. Maybe a bit because of the Blue Jays.
In recent years,
in certainly this last couple of months of last season.
Yeah.
What else do you think has put Toronto on the map in a way that it hasn't been there before?
I think, once again, that spotlight that Drake and the idea of OVO brought to the table has allowed people to be...
What's OVO?
OVO, October's Very Own. So that's basically the...
Can you tell I'm not cool?
Yeah.
I mean, I just fessed up there in front of everybody.
It's all right.
Because I don't know what OVO was.
We won't let it all out. But OVO is basically the movement behind Drake. So it's 40, Noah Shabib, who's his producer and longtime friend. It's Oliver. It's Future the Prince, who's actually a graduate of the Remix Project, who's his DJ and manager. It's an entire group of people now in the city that represent for Toronto. So OVO's kind of become this symbol and similar to One Love TO, an idea of hometown pride and success. And I think the spotlight that's been on our city has allowed people from all over the world to now be interested. What's going on in Toronto? Why is so much great music coming out? Why do all these people look different? Why are their slang a certain way? We have a lot to offer, and just people never knew it was up here.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website, tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.